what happens when a CEO orders a meal at his own diner and discovers the truth behind the smiles. Jacob Reed, the CEO of a small diner chain with 13 locations, had built his business from scratch over the last decade. Jacob Reed had everything a business owner could want. His diner chain was flourishing across the state, built on values of respect and community that he held dear. But beneath the polished surface, something was rotting away. Customer complaints rising, staff turnover skyrocketing, and whispers of a toxic workplace he couldn't ignore. Frustrated and determined to see the truth for himself, but when Jacob's regional managers insisted everything was fine, he made a decision that would change everything. Disguised in a scruffy beard and worn-out hoodie, the CEO stepped into his own restaurant as a regular employee. What he discovered in the next 8 hours would force him to question everything about the business he thought he knew. Jacob Reed had built his diner chain from the ground up. What started as a single location with just 10 tables in a small town quickly became a thriving business. The recipe was simple on paper. Good food, affordable prices, and an atmosphere where customers felt like family. But it wasn't just the menu that made the diner stand out. Jacob had a vision that reached well beyond plates of pancakes and steaming mugs of coffee. He wanted to create a workplace that reflected the values he grew up with: respect, fairness, and community. Before venturing into the restaurant business, Jacob's background wasn't anything remarkable on the surface. He had waited tables in high school and worked the kitchen at a neighborhood cafe during summers. What stood out, though, was the way he noticed people. Servers who went above and beyond for tips, managers who kept calm in chaotic shifts, customers who sought more than just a meal. They all stuck with him. Those memories planted the seeds for his future as a business owner. When he finally opened his first diner nearly 15 years ago, Jacob wrote one thing at the top of the menu: "This diner is about family, ours and yours." It became the unwritten motto for everything that came after. It wasn't long before the buzz started. Locals loved the welcoming atmosphere and word spread quickly. Within his first year, Jacob turned enough of a profit to expand into a second location. Every time he opened a new diner, Jacob made a habit of visiting the site daily during its first month. He chatted with customers, worked shifts alongside his employees, and showed up unexpectedly during busy times to lend a hand. These personal touches didn't go unnoticed. Employees called him the boss with an apron, a rare kind of leader who wasn't afraid to roll up his sleeves. Customers appreciated the continuity. Whether someone walked into the original location or one across town, they were greeted with the same friendly energy. But success didn't only mean happy diners. Jacob took pride in building a workplace where people genuinely enjoyed coming to work. Early in his career, he told a local newspaper, "I want every employee to feel this is a place they're proud to show up to every day." And for years they did. Staff turnover was minimal in those early days, and some of his longest-standing employees stayed with him well beyond their time as servers or cooks. On their birthdays, Jacob hand-wrote cards and added personal notes about their contributions to the team. It wasn't just employees who noticed the effort. Customers did too. Families returned every Sunday because they saw the same smiling wait staff here, a sign of stability they valued as much as the food. But things changed as the diner chain expanded to more locations. Where Jacob had once spent time in each restaurant personally managing the details, distance began to grow between him and his growing network of diners. It wasn't a matter of ambition or greed. Jacob simply wanted to share the environment he cherished with as many people as possible. Yet no matter how well-meaning his intentions were, they came with a cost. By the time Jacob's restaurant spanned across 13 locations, something was slipping through his fingers. At first, the signs were subtle. A customer might leave a review about slow service at one location, while another had a minor complaint about the way food was plated. Jacob trusted his managers to address these issues and ensure the experience customers loved was being carried out. But then patterns began emerging. The complaints became more frequent, and detailed stories of frustrated servers, long waiting times, and meals going cold before they were served. And it wasn't just the customers noticing issues. Employee turnover in several locations spiked, especially among newer hires. Despite the polished image presented in company updates and manager meetings, the foundation that Jacob had built on respect and community seemed to be cracking beneath the surface. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the glowing reports from his regional managers only painted part of the picture. Sure, the numbers looked healthy, sales were steady, profit margins intact, but as far as Jacob was concerned, true success didn't only live in spreadsheets. It lived in connections, with his employees, his customers, even the communities his diners served. The whisper of dissatisfaction that began as a faint signal now felt like a warning bell echoing louder every day. During a quarterly meeting with his leadership team, Jacob pressed his managers about recent turnover trends and the unusually high number of customer service complaints coming in from particular locations. He got the same kinds of answers every time. "We've been figure it out," or "It's not that serious." Customers complain about anything these days. Each answer left Jacob more uneasy than the last. Somewhere along the way, the connection he had built his business on had faded. But where and why? Jacob started sifting through his memories, trying to pinpoint where his diners stood at their best. 5 years ago, employees referred to their coworkers as a second family in glowing testimonials on social media sites. Customers, too, posted pictures from Jacob's diners, raising coffee mugs with captions like, "The friendliest place in town." But now, Jacob wasn't seeing those kinds of moments anymore. The flash of company-branded optimism, respect, community, family, was still there in their mission statements. It just wasn't ringing true in the stories he heard now. Studies on workplace culture began to creep into Jacob's thoughts during his evening reading. One study highlighted that companies with strong, positive environments showed higher employee retention rates and greater long-term performance. It mirrored what Jacob had always believed in: take care of your team, and your team takes care of the business. But putting that belief into action had grown harder as the company stretched its. And now, Jacob couldn't help but wonder if he had trusted others to uphold those values too long without checking in himself. The tension reached a boiling point late one night when Jacob sat alone in his office, scrolling through a folder of anonymous survey feedback from employees across the chain. Mixed in with the usual small notes about scheduling frustrations and food service tips were a handful of stark comments. "I feel like just a number. Our manager doesn't listen. They are only polite when Jacob is around." Each sentence struck like a blow. Jacob Reed had built his business on the idea that every employee mattered, and yet here it was in black and white. His vision wasn't alive in every corner of the chain. Not anymore. For the time Jacob finally closed the folder, he knew a decision had to be made, and quickly. This wasn't something that could be fixed through a couple of policy adjustments or a round of training videos. Jacob needed to understand the scope of the problem firsthand. No data point or second-hand report was going to give him the insight he craved at this moment. If he wanted to fix what had gone wrong, he'd have to start where it all began, inside the diners themselves. Jacob sat in his office after hours, the glow of his laptop screen casting long shadows across the room. Dozens of spreadsheets filled the monitor, each showing reassuring numbers. Sales were steady, profit margins healthy, performance metrics on track, everything a CEO would want to see, yet the numbers didn't tell the whole story. Over the last 6 months, he had noticed a troubling pattern. Customer complaints appeared more frequently in online reviews, and employee turnover at certain locations had spiked. The reports presented a business that was thriving, but reality didn't seem to agree. He couldn't ignore the growing unease he felt every time he heard the words "it's fine" during manager meetings. "We're short-staffed, but we're managing," one regional manager had casually said during the last quarterly briefing. Another had shrugged off a question about customer complaints, insisting they probably just had a bad day. Jacob wanted to believe these were isolated issues, But the more he looked, the less confident he felt. Overwhelmed shifts, longer wait times, and even accusations of rudeness trickled into his inbox. While none of it appeared catastrophic, together it painted a picture Jacob couldn't ignore. He thought back to a recent complaint he'd skimmed while scrolling through customer feedback late at night. A regular diner had written about a particularly frustrating evening, what she described as short staff chaos. "We've always loved this place," her review began, "but lately, the energy feels different. The waitress apologized at least 5 times before we even ordered, and our food was cold by the time it came." Another review from a different location told a similar story. Employees who seemed rushed and distracted, orders served wrong, and customers leaving dissatisfied. One comment stuck with Jacob. "It's like the staff doesn't care anymore." But it wasn't just the customers. Employee feedback revealed a completely different struggle. Through the anonymous surveys Jacob had insisted on continuing, patterns emerged in responses. A cashier at one location mentioned feeling unsupported, an unanticipated dynamic. A cook from a diner 3 towns over described their manager as impatient and unapproachable. "I used to love working here," one server had written. "Now, it feels like no one's listening. I'm tired of being treated like my thoughts don't matter." These weren't just signs of frustration. They were warnings that something had gone seriously wrong within the culture he had once worked so hard to create. The disconnect between the reports and the reality gnawed at him. How could sales remain stable if the customer experience was deteriorating? Why had employee turnover jumped in half the chain while the other half seemed unaffected? Jacob pored over the data again, looking for something he'd missed, but hard numbers only told part of the story. The problem was something you couldn't measure in a spreadsheet. He realized the growing gap wasn't in profits, but in the experience customers and employees alike no longer felt the sense of connection the diners had always prided themselves on. Jacob thought about the changes that had occurred as the business expanded. Once he had been a constant presence in his restaurants, filling in during busy shifts and getting to know his staff personally. He used to be able to recognize every team member by name, but now, with over 200 employees across multiple towns, he relied heavily on his managers and regional leaders to uphold his vision. And for a long time it had worked. They sent back cheerful updates, reported strong performance stats, and put out small fires before they could turn into something bigger. Or at least, that's what Jacob thought. A research study he'd skimmed earlier that week popped into his mind. It highlighted how leaders in growing businesses often unintentionally disconnect from the day-to-day realities of their teams. The more layers there were between executives and frontline employees, the harder it became to get an honest read of the workplace environment. That idea hit uncomfortably close to home. Jacob had always relied on his managers to be the bridge between his vision and the people who carried it. Had those bridges crumbled without him realizing? As troubling as it all seemed, the resistance he encountered from his own team bothered him more. Any time he raised concerns about things like turnover or tense customer feedback, his managers dismissed it. "It's just a tough hiring market," one of them said about the increased employee departures. "Anyone who's leaving is just looking for a change," said another. Their insistence that everything was under control or ignored. The tipping point came during a discussion about training programs. Jacob had suggested investing more into onboarding processes to help new hires integrate better. One regional manager looked directly at him and said, "Honestly, I don't think it's the training. Some people just aren't cut out for this." That offhand remark stayed with Jacob long after the meeting ended, because it confirmed what he dreaded. Complacency had crept in. Giving a sigh, he finally turned to look at his team members. Not one could air another secret. Whatever needed this job to fix a sense of urgency that had been eating away at him for weeks. Whatever needed fixing wasn't going to come from the top-down reports or polished quarterly briefings. It needed to come from someone who could experience the business firsthand. Jacob decided he could no longer rely on second-hand information. If no one else understood the problem, he'd figure it out on his own. Something about the idea of walking into his own diner, not as the owner but as someone on the floor, felt necessary. He couldn't understand the employees' frustrations or the customers' complaints unless he stood in their shoes. That night, with the office silent around him, the plan started taking shape. He thought carefully about how to make it work without disrupting the natural rhythm of the staff. He'd have to pick a location far enough from his corporate office that no one would recognize him. One of the diners, a mid-sized spot in a quiet suburban town about 2 hours away, seemed like the perfect choice. Few of the employees there had ever met Jacob in person, and the location's recent complaints lining up with some of the concerns weighing most heavily on his mind. It was exactly the kind of place where the picture-perfect reports didn't quite match the reality. And then there was the question of disguising himself. Even though Jacob wasn't a particularly public figure, the risk of being identified by an observant employee still loomed. He decided to grow out his beard, something he hadn't done in over a decade, and keep it scruffy. He traded in his tailored suit for a hoodie with faint coffee stains and a well-worn pair of jeans. Thick-rimmed glasses, the kind he hadn't needed since college, completed the look. That night, he packed a small duffel bag with the clothes he would wear when he went undercover, his mind quiet for the first time in weeks. It felt right. He didn't need more reports, and he definitely didn't need to hear more second-hand summaries from managers. If he wanted answers, he'd find them himself. Only after experiencing what his employees and customers encountered every day could he begin to piece together the truth. And with that, Jacob knew exactly where he'd go to find it. Jacob parked his car 2 blocks away from the diner, a conscious decision to keep a low profile. The drive had given him plenty of time to question whether this plan was going to work. Dressed in a faded hoodie, worn jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days, he glanced at his reflection in the rear-view mirror. The scruffy beard and thick-rimmed glasses made him look every bit the part of someone no one would associate with a polished seat. To seal the disguise, he reached for an old baseball cap from the passenger seat and tugged it down low over his forehead. Few, if any, of the employees at this location had ever met him in person, and after weeks of planning, it was time to find out if the reality he feared matched the whispers he'd been hearing. As he approached the restaurant, the first thing he noticed was its faded exterior. The sign, which was meant to shine as a welcoming beacon, looked dull and in need of repair. It wasn't outright neglect, but it quietly undermined the warmth and charm the diner once radiated. Stepping inside, Jacob paused to adjust the strap of the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee filled the room. At first glance, everything seemed typical. Booths were filled with customers, the low hum of conversation mingling with the metallic clinks of cutlery against plates. But as Jacob moved toward the counter, he began to notice details that didn't sit right with him. The sense of energy he always associated with his diners felt muted. The staff looked hurried and tense, their smiles faint and fleeting. A young waitress weaved her way between tables with practiced movement, balancing plates in one hand reflexively with the other. Her name tag read Megan, and though she wore the same uniform every employee did, she seemed to be carrying far more weight than anyone else. Her face, framed by loose strands of dark hair that had slipped out of her ponytail, looked tired. She greeted customers with polite, if tight, smiles, but the strain behind her expression was hard to miss. Jacob slid into a booth at the far side of the room, his back to the wall. From here, he had a clear view of the entire dining area. It didn't take long for him to notice the cracks in the system. Orders seemed to stack up at the pass-boom window by the kitchen, waiting longer than they should for someone to take them out to the tables. Megan, meanwhile, darted back and forth across the room, picking up the slack. She refilled coffee mugs while offering quick apologies to customers for the wait. Another customer, seated near the counter, muttered something about missing silverware just as Megan stepped over to handle it. Her voice was calm and pleasant as she addressed his concerns, but Jacob could tell she was on the verge of being overwhelmed. 2 other servers were working the floor, but the division of labor was anything but even. He had always emphasized teamwork as a core part of the diner's operation. The staff was supposed to function like a well-oiled machine, each piece supporting the others. What he was seeing now was more like a disjointed scramble. From his seat, Jacob could also hear snippets of conversations between the employees. The kitchen staff traded short, clipped remarks, voices tinged with frustration. Plates occasionally landed too heavily on the counter, the sound sharp against the quiet resolve of the room. None of it was outwardly chaotic, but the tension in the air was undeniable. This wasn't the kind of environment Jacob wanted for his employees or his customers. And yet, it was playing out right in front of him. Jacob reached for a menu, keeping one eye on the room as he flipped it open. Even the menu felt like another piece of a faded picture. The corners were slightly bent and stained with watermarks. It still carried the familiar branding he'd worked so hard to solidify over the years, but here, in this context, it felt disconnected from the atmosphere around him. It was as if the physical space carried the bones of his original vision, but the heart of it, the energy, the culture, the people, had been drained. What Jacob was witnessing wasn't unique. He had read articles about how subtle breakdowns in workplace culture could snowball into visible issues, particularly when leaders became disconnected from daily operations. A recent study he remembered skimming explained how managers often rely on middle layers to interpret frontline experiences, but at some point, those layers distort the reality of what happens at ground level. Going undercover, as risky as it felt, now seemed like the only way Jacob could truly understand the widening gap between the polished corporate reports and the lived experiences of his employees. As the morning wore on, Jacob gained a clearer view of the struggles plaguing the team. He watched Megan juggle her responsibilities, seemingly doing the work of 2 or 3 people. At one point, she carried a tray of drinks in one hand while balancing a separate stack of dirty dishes in the other, squeezing through the tightly packed tables with practiced efficiency. If she bumped into a chair or accidentally spilled a drop of coffee, she immediately apologized, smoothing over the moment before anyone could voice a complaint. To the untrained eye, she appeared to be holding it all together, but to Jacob, it was obvious she was running on fumes. Later, as Megan approached the counter to pick up an order, she paused for just a moment. She rubbed her temple with the tips of her fingers, her expression falling briefly into one of wariness, before she forced her features back into a neutral line. Jacob noticed the way her shoulders slumped the minute she turned her back to the dining area. It was the kind of fatigue that couldn't be remedied by a single day off. It spoke to something deeper, more systemic. She wasn't just tired, she seemed defeated. Jacob stared down at the coffee mug in front of him, untouched since Megan had placed it there with an automatic enjoy. Every movement she made told a story of someone who cared about her job but didn't feel supported in it. The whispers he'd heard about staff being overwhelmed and unappreciated were no longer whispers. They were facts, unfolding right before his eyes. As lunchtime neared and the crowd began to thin, Jacob leaned back in his booth, taking mental notes. While it was clear there were problems here, what struck him most was the sheer resilience of people like Megan. She was the backbone of this operation, holding it together despite all the pressure working against her. Yet even her efforts couldn't mask the strain saturating the diner. For Jacob, it wasn't just a case of observing cracks in the system, it was about recognizing the human cost behind those cracks. Then, as Megan disappeared into the swinging doors of the kitchen, a muffled sound broke through the hum of the restaurant. It was soft at first, but unmistakable. She was crying. Jacob followed the sound of crying, slipping through the back hallway that led to the kitchen. The door, a little ajar, gave him a narrow view of what was happening inside. He saw Megan near the sink, her back partly turned, trying to stifle her tears as Rick, the manager, loomed over her. His voice was sharp and cutting, filling the quiet space with harsh critiques. "If you can't handle the pressure, maybe you're in the wrong job," Rick said, his tone as casual as it was dismissive. Megan didn't respond right away, instead focusing on wiping down a tray in front of her, her movements strained and mechanical. Jacob stayed in the shadow of the doorframe, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. There was something chilling about how casually Rick spoke to Megan, as though her exhaustion and distress weren't worth acknowledging. The cooks at the nearby prep stations remained silent, their heads down as if trying to make themselves invisible. One wiped his hands on his apron, quickly looked away when Rick turned his head. No one stepped in. The entire kitchen seemed gripped by an unwritten rule: avoid conflict and don't get involved. The scene made Jacob's stomach churn. He didn't need to know Megan personally to understand the toll this environment was taking on her. Every action she attempted seemed to draw more criticism from Rick. When a plate on the nearby counter wobbled as Megan placed it down, Rick let out a loud sigh and shook his head. "This is why everything takes so long," he muttered. Megan's head sank lower, and though her voice didn't carry, Jacob could hear a faint, wavering apology. The interaction felt scripted, like something that had played out many times before. Rick's lack of empathy and Megan's quiet attempts to navigate it were far too polished to be a one-off event. The worst part for Jacob wasn't even Rick's words, though they were sharp enough. It was the look on Megan's face that stayed with him. Even when Rick stepped back, she seemed braced for the next wave of criticism. Her exhaustion wasn't just physical, it clung to her posture, the sagging of her shoulders, the tired press of her lips into a forced neutral expression. She was holding herself together, but her foundation was visibly crumbling. The rest of the room reflected the same atmosphere. No one offered words of encouragement or even a reassuring glance in Megan's direction, afraid of inviting Rick's attention. The kitchen wasn't just tense, it was deeply fractured. Toxic management, like what Jacob was witnessing, could operate subtly or loudly, but either way it left its mark. The dismissive tone Rick carried wasn't just undermining Megan's confidence. It was setting an example for the entire team. Jacob thought back to a research paper he'd read not long ago about workplace toxicity. The study explained how environments like these erode morale, productivity, and even physical well-being. Stress and anxiety spike as employees feel devalued, unsupported, and in some cases outright threatened. There was no need for complex analysis to see that effect playing out here. The listless energy of the staff and the quiet compliance with Rick's behavior spoke louder than any statistic ever could. Rick, meanwhile, glanced at a clipboard in his hand, oblivious to the emotional wreckage around him, or perhaps choosing to ignore it. He walked closer to Megan again, his voice biting. "How many tables are still waiting? You're supposed to be keeping up back here." Megan visibly tensed but kept wiping the tray in her hands. "I'm trying," she said, her voice cracking slightly. It wasn't a defensive reply, it was closer to resignation, a weary attempt to keep herself afloat. Rick responded with a snort. "Trying isn't good enough. I need results." Jacob's jaw tightened at the words. Results, he thought bitterly. It was clear Rick equated results with output, ignoring the human elements that fed into them. Jacob could see the bigger picture Rick was failing to grasp. Megan wasn't the problem. The system was broken, and Rick's toxic leadership was amplifying every issue on the floor. Employees weren't lazy or unmotivated. They were beaten down by an environment that offered no support, no understanding, and no path to improvement. Rick's approach seemed to revolve around power, not collaboration, and his dismissiveness hung heavy in the air long after he spoke. The longer Jacob stood there, the harder it became to stay in disguise. His mind raced with what he'd read earlier about the lasting effects of toxic work environments. Employees subjected to constant pressure and poor leadership often experienced heightened levels of stress, leading to burnout. Chronic exposure to such environments didn't just affect day-to-day performance, it could have long-term impacts on mental health. Megan, barely holding herself together in that moment, wasn't just dealing with a bad day. This was a pattern, a routine erosion of her confidence and sense of self-worth. Jacob's knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the doorway, struggling to decide whether to keep observing or step in. He knew rushing into a confrontation could upend everything he'd planned, but staying silent weighed on him in a way he hadn't expected. As Rick walked away from Megan, gesturing toward the clipboard and muttering about inefficiencies, Jacob made his decision. There was no longer a choice to be made. Stepping out of the shadows, Jacob called out, his voice firm. "Rick!" The manager turned, caught off guard by the sudden interruption. The rest of the kitchen froze, most of the staff turning toward the unexpected voice. Megan's head lifted slightly, her expression a mixture of surprise and worry. Rick scanned Jacob, likely struggling to place him. "Who are you?" Rick asked, his tone sharp, as though preparing to dismiss him like one of the kooks. Jacob pulled off his glasses and set them on the counter. "I'm Jacob Reed," he said evenly, meeting Rick's eyes. The silence that followed was thick, the recognition dawning on Rick's face. His posture changed instantly, his overconfidence draining as he realized who stood before him. The rest of the staff exchanged glances, their murmured breaths barely audible. When Jacob spoke again, his voice held none of Rick's edge, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. "There's always time to treat people with respect," he began, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "I've been watching all morning, and what I've seen here is unacceptable. No one should be made to feel the way you've made Megan feel." Rick floundered, some stammered excuse forming on his lips, but Jacob didn't give him the chance to speak. The moment wasn't for justifying bad behavior, it was for setting a new standard. Addressing not just Rick but the entire kitchen, Jacob gestured toward Megan and continued. "This business depends on people like her, hard-working, dedicated staff who care about the customers and each other. And the way you speak to her, what kind of example do you think that sets for the rest of the team?" The words landed heavily. Rick stood frozen, realizing his usual dismissiveness had no weight here. Behind him, Megan shifted uncomfortably, her hands still gripping the edge of the sink. For the first time all shift, she wasn't the one being questioned. Jacob turned to her, softening his tone. "Megan, you're doing an incredible job. No employee should shoulder the burden you've carried today. That's going to change." Jacob straightened, his gaze streeping across the room before locking back on Rick. "Effective immediately, you're done here," he said with finality, his voice calm but firm. Rick's eyes widened, the gathered realization of what had just happened sinking in. The kitchen fell into a deafening silence as Jacob stepped toward Megan and the now still team. Whatever culture Rick had cultivated was gone in an instant. Jacob turned, leaving nothing else to chance. It was time to fix what had been broken. Jacob stood in front of the gathered staff later that same afternoon, the kitchen now eerily quiet compared to the chaos of the morning. The remaining employees stood in a loose circle, their body language uncertain. Some crossed their arms or shifted their weight from one foot to the other, while others stared at the floor. Megan was there too, her eyes red-rimmed but her posture steady as she folded a dish towel in her hands. Jacob knew that earning their trust wouldn't happen overnight. The damage left behind by Rick's leadership went far deeper than what he had seen in one shift. If he wanted to make things right, he would need to start here now, with honesty. Taking a half step forward, Jacob raised his voice just enough to fill the room without overwhelming it. "You deserve better," he began, his tone even and deliberate. "This diner, this business, was built on the belief that respect and community come above anything else. That's how it started, and that's what I'm here to bring back." His words hung in the air for a moment, met with silence. The employees were listening, but their guarded expressions told Jacob all he needed to know. Promises alone wouldn't move them. They had likely heard their share of empty reassurances in the past. Jacob ran a hand through his beard as he continued. "I've seen what's been happening here. I've seen how hard you work, how much you care, and how much you've been asked to carry without the support you deserve. That's on me as much as anyone else. I trusted the system to take care of you, but the truth is I stepped back too far." He paused, scanning their faces, looking for even a flicker of change. What he saw was cautious curiosity. They hadn't expected him to take that kind of accountability, and for the first time in months, Jacob felt like he was actually reaching them. Turning toward Megan, who stood closest to him, Jacob addressed her directly. "Megan," he said, his voice steady but warm, "you've been holding up more than your fair share. That ends today." Starting now, you're getting a raise, one you've earned 10 times over. And I'm putting together a system to make sure everyone here gets recognized for their hard work, not just in words but with real action." Megan blinked, clearly taken aback, and her lips quivered as though she wanted to respond but wasn't sure how. The room stirred faintly, a few of the other employees glancing between each other. Jacob turned his focus to the broader group, holding their attention. "This isn't just about fixing today's problems," he said. "It's about making sure that moving forward you have the tools you need to succeed. That means new leadership. That means proper staffing levels so no one feels like they're carrying the weight of 5 people. And that means taking a hard look at what hasn't been working." He nodded toward Connor, one of the kitchen staff who had stepped up earlier in the day to help Megan when the shifts had reached their breaking point. "Connor," Jacob said, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, "I watched you lead by example this morning. Every time things got tough, you stepped in, no hesitation. That's what this team needs, leadership from people who care about their coworkers as much as the customers. I'm promoting you to assistant manager." Connor's mouth fell open slightly and his wide-eyed expression mirrored the disbelief spreading through the rest of the employees. For a moment, the room buzzed with murmurs, the skeptical tension softening into something closer to hope. Jacob held his ground, making sure they could all see the seriousness in his expression. "This is just the beginning," he continued. "There's more coming. Starting next week, we're bringing in more staff so that every shift is balanced and no one is left short-handed. We're also updating the equipment. Some of those machines out there are older than I am, and that's not fair to the team trying to do their best with them." As he outlined his plans, Jacob's tone never wavered, but it remained grounded. He didn't sugarcoat the challenges ahead. He made it clear that rebuilding trust and reworking systems wouldn't be an overnight transformation. "I know words can only go so far," he said, bringing his speech to its next point. "That's why I'll be here in person for the next few months, working alongside you while we make this right. If you have concerns, you tell me. If there's something you need to do your job better, I want to hear it. This isn't going to be one-sided. We're in this together." The shift in mood was subtle but unmistakable. The employees weren't smiling or cheering outright, but their wary stances had relaxed slightly. They were looking at each other, nodding faintly, and when Jacob asked if anyone had immediate questions or feedback, a cook near the back mumbled something about staffing issues on the night shifts. Jacob nodded in acknowledgement, scribbling it into the notebook he'd pulled from his back pocket. Even such a minor act seemed to matter. Someone had been heard. Megan, still near the front of the group, finally found her voice. She glanced nervously at Connor before focusing on Jacob. "It's a lot to take in," she admitted quietly, her voice still tinged with the fatigue she carried from earlier. "But thank you." It wasn't much, but it carried a weight of sincerity that Jacob didn't take lightly. Giving a small nod, Jacob gestured gently to the rest of the group. "I know it won't feel real right away," he said, "but I promise you, this isn't about words. You'll see the change, every one of you." Jacob's plans weren't just reactions to what he'd observed in the diner. They reflected everything he had learned about how to rebuild morale and trust in a workforce. Research showed that recognizing employees' contributions in tangible ways like raises or promotions was one of the strongest methods for improving morale. Jacob also knew how critical proper staffing and updated resources were to creating a positive work environment. Studies had demonstrated that burnout among employees was often tied to both excessive workloads and the inefficiency of outdated tools or structures, a problem he had seen firsthand that morning. O'Brien likely shows him what it takes to win, a problem he had solving immediate problems. He was preventing the same patterns from repeating. The next steps were already in motion. Equipment orders had been placed, job listings for the additional staff had gone live, and Jacob was reaching out to candidates with reputations for compassionate leadership to fill the manager position. He'd also scheduled one-on-one meetings with each employee to hear their concerns in more detail, a step he hoped would reinforce his commitment to transparency. For the first time in months, The mood in the diner felt less like survival and more like possibility. Employees weren't all convinced, not yet, but there was a sense that things could in fact change. Jacob wasn't naive. He knew it would take time and consistency to undo the harm that had been caused. But as the staff dispersed, returning to their tasks with an energy that was cautious but steadier than before, he allowed himself one small, hopeful thought. The first brick in rebuilding the foundation had been laid. When word spread that Jacob had gone undercover at one of his diners, it created a ripple effect that no amount of corporate communication could have achieved. Employees throughout the chain began talking, not just about how their CEO had stepped in to fire an abusive manager, but about what that meant for the rest of them. Rumors traveled between locations like whispers across booths at breakfast rush. Would Jacob visit another diner? Would their own concerns finally be addressed? For the first time in months, employees who had felt ignored started wondering if things were about to change. At the suburban diner where everything began, the changes were already palpable. Megan seemed less tense on her shifts, the hollowness in her expression replaced by something closer to relief. Connor, now assistant manager, was already stepping into his new role, ensuring that the staff felt supported during busy lunch shifts. 3 new hires had joined the team, lightening the workload for everyone else, and the once faded energy of the dining area seemed to glow just a little brighter. The improvement wasn't just felt, it was visible. Customers commented on the faster service, and one regular even remarked, "It feels like the old diner is back." But Jacob's reach didn't stop at one location. Employees at other diners, some of whom had never seen their CO outside of training videos, began wondering what it meant that he was taking action in one store. At a busier location near the downtown district, staff whispered about how long they'd been dealing with their own frustrations. One server leaned over to "What's happening here?" At another location, a cashier who felt overlooked for months confessed to a friend, "Maybe this is our chance, too." Jacob understood that skepticism would always linger until those employees saw tangible evidence of change. That's why he didn't wait to roll out a new approach. Instead of relying solely on regional managers to relay employee concerns, Jacob implemented regular meetings at each location from the ground up. He wanted his team to know their frustrations wouldn't just be heard, they'd be addressed. "This isn't just about fixing one store," Jacob told the staff during his first meeting at another location. "It's about creating an environment where everyone feels valued." These meetings were as much about listening as they were about rebuilding trust. At first, the staff seemed hesitant to speak up, lingering in the back of the room or exchanging uncertain glances. But Jacob kept the space open, waiting patiently for the first person to break the silence. During one meeting, a dishwasher raised his hand. "The equipment in the back breaks down all the time," he said, fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. "We're always running behind because of it." Jacob nodded and pulled out his notebook to jot down the specifics. "That's not the kind of burden you should be carrying," he said. "We'll fix it." Over the next few weeks, the meetings revealed patterns. Staffing shortages hadn't only been an issue at the suburban diner. It was a problem chain-wide, stretching employees too thin and leaving them drained after every shift. Faulty equipment wasn't isolated either. Dishwashers, ovens, and coffee machines across locations showed their age, forcing employees to work harder just to meet the same standard. Scheduling concerns also emerged, with several workers noting that inconsistent shifts were making it difficult to balance their roles with other commitments. Jacob continued showing up, notebook in hand, taking notes on what mattered most to the people who made up his workforce. By the second or third meeting, employees began speaking up more freely. A cashier at one diner listed off menu items they couldn't keep in stock because of supply chain inefficiencies, while a server pointed out how training for new hires often left them unprepared for the realities of the floor. They weren't just airing frustrations, they were identifying solutions alongside their CEO, something most of them had never experienced before. Studies Jacob had read echoed what was now playing out in front of him. Research showed that businesses with transparent communication systems were more likely to earn employees' trust and retain talent, especially in industries with high burnout rates. Listening to employees wasn't just about morale, it was about creating real accountability. Leaders who overlooked that often found themselves addressing problems only after they'd spiraled into full-blown crisis. It was a mistake Jacob was determined not to repeat. The promises he'd made at the first diner weren't just words. The results were beginning to show across the chain. New hires were brought in to ease workloads, creating schedules that allowed for better balance and preventing burnout. Outdated kitchen equipment was methodically replaced with modern, reliable machines. Even simple additions like better time management software for scheduling made immediate impact, and it wasn't just the employees who noticed. Customers began leaving reviews again, commenting on quicker service, cleaner restaurants, and friendlier staff. The once negative pattern of feedback began reversing, location by location. Still, Jacob knew that a few visible improvements weren't enough to call the work complete. Challenges remained. At one diner, the culture entrenched by a long-time indifferent manager proved tougher to turn around than expected. At another, employees were hesitant to trust promises of change, still raw from months of frustration. "How do we know this will last?" one server had asked during. Jacob didn't offer a grand speech in response. He simply put in more time. He visited that diner twice as often, addressed small issues as they came up, and made sure every employee there knew his face and his purpose. The biggest shift Jacob noticed wasn't in equipment or schedules, but in the tone of the team. Conversations on the floor started changing. Staff who had once worked quietly and separately began collaborating again, covering for each other when needed. At one location, a waitress stepped in to help a new hire carry a heavy load of plates, smiling warmly as she finished. At another, a manager was overheard comforting an overwhelmed cashier, thanking them for their effort and offering solutions instead of scolding them. These quiet moments were proof of Jacob's vision beginning to take shape again. Jacob recommitted himself to ensuring the foundation of respect and community would never erode again under his watch. He created a tracking system to ensure staff concerns were regularly revisited, not just politely acknowledged and forgotten. Regional managers were required to attend training on leadership that prioritized empathy and active listening. Anonymous feedback systems were improved, providing a way for employees to speak freely without fear of repercussion. These measures weren't just temporary fixes, they were safeguards to keep the values of the diner chain alive across every location. As the effort grew, Jacob saw how the changes started to ripple outward. Employees began sharing their experiences, both in person and online, talking about how their workplaces were improving. One former server who had left months ago even reapplied, saying they felt like the workplace had found its heart again. Word spread quickly. Customers who had once been regulars started coming back, curious to see if the shift was real. The chain experienced a slow but steady uptick in sales, not because of flashy advertising or promotions, but because people felt welcome again. True leadership, Jacob realized, wasn't about writing policies or holding meetings from behind a desk. It was about showing up, listening, taking action, and proving time and again that people matter more than anything else. The chain still had work to do, and Jacob wasn't under any illusion that every issue would disappear overnight. But for the first time since he'd parked outside that diner weeks ago, Jacob felt the weight on his shoulders lighten, just a little. Jacob's journey showed that true leadership isn't about sitting behind a desk, about showing up when it counts. Through listening and decisive action, he turned a failing workplace into the one he'd always envisioned, built on respect, supported by community. His employees weren't just given promises. They saw change in hiring, equipment, and workplace culture. What about you? Whether you're a leader or part of a team, ask yourself, are you contributing to a positive environment? Now is the time to reflect and act. Leadership isn't measured by numbers. It's measured by the people whose lives you touch every day.